Chams' tribal charms' secret for the suffering. Van was a young doctor from the International Friendship Hospital. For the next week, she wouldn't be working there anymore. Instead, she was assigned to lead a community program that provided education about dengue fever, organized a blood drive, and distributed donations from the hospital's charity fund to the residents of MinThy village, located in Tam Ninh commune. This was different from the other projects Van had participated in before, because most of the residents in this village were Cham people. They spoke Vietnamese with difficulty and lived in stilt houses. Joining Van were 3 other medical professionals, Sung, Ling, and Duke, all from the infectious diseases and parasitology departments of the hospital. There was also Duok, a middle-aged driver. On the first day of their journey, as soon as they entered Ninh Thuan province, they could feel the scorching heat. The hot wind swept across the sand dunes on either side of the road, making Sung worried about her skin getting damaged in such weather. Du, sitting in the front seat, tried to lighten the mood with a joke about the unbearable heat, but the group continued in uneasy silence. As they approached Vinh Hoi, the road narrowed and became increasingly difficult to traverse. The dirt road was rough and uneven, unlike the paved roads they were used to. The truck, loaded with medical supplies and donations, couldn't go any further. "What should we do now?" Van Lin asked, concerned. Van remembered seeing a group of motorcycle taxis at the bus station in the town. "We need to hire them to take us the rest of the way," she decided after calculating the additional costs. They sent the truck back to the town, hired the motorcycle taxis, and made their way into the village. Arriving at a wooden house that looked sturdy but old, Van and her team got off the motorcycles. Ling, curious, asked, "Why are we stopping here? Can't we go further in? We're supposed to wait here for the local officials to come and guide us," Van replied. As they waited, Duke, always the curious one, tried knocking on the door of the house. A loud, hollow sound echoed, but there was no answer. "This place looks abandoned," Duke muttered, disappointed. Suddenly an elderly man appeared out of nowhere, startling the group. He was around 50, his skin tanned and wrinkled, holding a wooden stick. His demeanor was hostile, and he spoke in broken Vietnamese. "Who are you?" "Thieves," he accused. Duke quickly stepped forward, trying to calm him down. "No sir, we're doctors. We're here to provide medical support and donate supplies. We're not thieves," he explained, showing his identification. The old man seemed unconvinced but didn't push further. Just then, another man arrived on a motorcycle. He was dressed more formally and introduced himself as Hai, the local official assigned to assist them. After a brief discussion, Hai suggested they stay in the wooden house temporarily, as it was the only place available. Though the old man seemed unwelcoming at first, he soon changed his attitude when Van offered to pay for their stay. His face softened and he invited them in with a smile. "You can stay as long as you need," he said, now appearing very hospitable. Van and her team were surprised by the sudden shift in his demeanor, but were relieved to have a place to rest. As night fell, the atmosphere in the house became increasingly eerie. Shadows danced on the walls, and the wind howled through the cracks in the wooden panels. The group huddled together in the center of the room, sharing stories to pass the time. Suddenly they heard a knock at the door. Duke, the closest, got up to open it. Outside stood a woman, her face pale and wet from the rain. She seemed frantic and fell to her knees as soon as she saw the old man, speaking rapidly in the Cham language. The old man's expression turned serious. "There's nothing to worry about, just a small matter," he assured the group, leaving with the woman without another word. Left alone, the group felt a chill run down their spines. "What's going on here?" Ling whispered, her voice trembling. They spent a restless night, unable to shake off the feeling of being watched. The next day, they continued their work, educating the villagers and organizing the blood drive. The villagers were welcoming, even inviting them to a local funeral feast. However, Van couldn't help but notice that Hai was always watching them from a distance, his eyes filled with an unspoken warning. That night, Van had a strange dream. She saw herself standing in a dark, open field surrounded by graves. From the graves, dark figures began to raise, their faces twisted in agony. She tried to run, but her feet wouldn't move. One of the figures grabbed her leg, and she woke up with a scream, drenched in sweat. "It's just a dream," she told herself. But she couldn't shake off the fear that gripped her heart. Over the next few days, strange incidents continued to happen. Items in the house moved on their own, and the group heard whispers in the night. Lin and Duke began to experience nightmares as well. They decided to confront the old man, but he was always evasive. Finally, they consulted a local shaman who revealed that the house was cursed. "This is a charm curse," he said gravely. "It's meant to drive away outsiders determined to break the curse." Van and her team decided to leave the village and seek help. But just as they were about to leave, the old man appeared again, this time looking desperate. "Please, don't go," he begged. "If you leave, the spirits will come after you, terrified but resolute." The group left anyway, hoping that distance would keep them safe. But the curse followed them back to the city. Ban began to see shadows in her apartment, and one night she woke up to find herself being dragged out of bed by an unseen force. The nightmares returned worse than before. Desperate, she turned to a Buddhist monk who performed a ritual to cleanse her spirit. The disturbances stopped, but Ban knew she would never forget the terror she experienced in that cursed village. A week later, she received a call from Hai, the local official. His voice was shaky, and he sounded terrified. The old man ... his dead, Hai stammered. He was found in his house, surrounded by ... shadows. Ban felt a cold shiver run down her spine. She hung up the phone and stared out the window, knowing that some things are better left buried. Ban felt a shiver run down her spine as she hung up the phone. The old man's death, surrounded by shadows, confirmed her deepest fears. The curse was far from over. She couldn't shake off the feeling that something terrible was about to happen. The events in the village and her own haunting experiences had left her shaken, but she had thought it was over. Clearly she had been wronged that night. Ban found herself unable to sleep. Every sound in her apartment seemed amplified: the creaking of the wooden floor, the distant hum of the city, the ticking of the clock. She lay in bed, her eyes wide open, staring at the ceiling, her mind racing. She kept seeing shadows moving in the corners of her vision. Every time she turned her head to look, there was nothing there. But the feeling of being watched, of something lurking just out of sight, was palpable. Suddenly, a loud crash echoed through her apartment. Man jumped up, her heart racing. She grabbed her phone, turning on the flashlight, and cautiously made her way out of the bedroom. As she approached the living room, she saw that a picture frame had fallen off the wall. It lay on the floor, the glass shattered. Ban's breath hitched in her throat as she saw that the photograph inside the frame, a picture of her with her colleagues during the trip to the village, was scorched around the edges. Before she could process what she was seeing, the lights flickered and went out, plunging the apartment into darkness. The only light came from her phone, which she clutched tightly in her hand. The room grew colder, and a chill ran down her spine. She could feel it, the presence of something unseen, something malevolent. She tried to calm her breathing, but it was no use. Panic was setting in. From the darkness, she heard a whisper, a low, guttural voice speaking in a language she did not understand. The sound sent a wave of fear coursing through her body. It was as if the walls themselves were whispering, closing in around her. She backed away slowly, her hands shaking, her breath coming in shallow gasps. "Get out!" the voice hissed, louder this time, echoing through the small space. Ban stumbled back into her bedroom, slamming the door shut. She leaned against it, trying to steady her racing heart. She quickly dialed Ducey's number, praying he would answer. After a few tense rings, he picked up. "Ban, it's late. What's wrong?" he asked, his voice groggy with sleep. "Dude, something's here. In my apartment, I think it's the curse," Van stammered, her voice trembling. There was a pause on the other end. "Stay where you are. I'm coming over," he said, his tone suddenly serious. "Don't open the door for anyone. I'll be there soon." Ban nodded, even though he couldn't see her. "Please hurry," she whispered before hanging up. She sat in the dark room, her back against the door, waiting. Minutes felt like hours as the whispers continued, growing louder and more insistent. She could feel them surrounding her, pressing against her from all sides. She squeezed her eyes shut, trying to block them out. A knock on the door startled her. She jumped up, almost dropping her phone. "Van, it's me." Duke, came the voice from the other side. She rushed to open the door, relief flooding her body. As soon as she opened the door, Duke stepped inside, his face pale, eyes wide with fear. "What the hell is going on?" he asked, looking around the dark apartment. "I don't know. I thought it was over," Ban began, but she was cut off by a loud, rumbling noise. The floor beneath them seemed to vibrate, as if something was moving beneath the surface. "We need to get out of here," Duke said urgently, grabbing her hand. Now, but as they turned to leave, the door slammed shut on its own with a deafening bang. The room grew even colder, and the whispers became a chorus, a cacophony of voices shouting in anger and pain. The shadows seemed to grow, moving towards them, reaching out with tendrils of darkness. Van screamed as she felt something brush against her arm, cold and clammy like the touch of a corpse. She yanked her arm away, backing up against the wall, her eyes wide with terror. "What do we do?" she cried, her voice barely audible over the noise. Duke's face was grim. "We have to confront it," he said, his voice steady despite the fear in his eyes. "Whatever this is, it's not going to stop until we do." He stepped forward, raising his arms as if to challenge the darkness. "We're not afraid of you," he shouted, his voice echoing in the small room. "We know what you are." For a moment, the shadows seemed to hesitate, and the whispers quieted. But then, as if enraged by his defiance, the darkness surged forward, enveloping them both. Van felt the pressure on her chest, as if something was squeezing the air out of her lungs. She couldn't breathe, couldn't move. Suddenly, the room was filled with a blinding light. Van shielded her eyes, squinting against the brightness. And then, as quickly as it had come, the light was gone, and the apartment was silent. The shadows had vanished and the air was warm again. Van and Duke stood there, panting, looking around in shock. What happened?" Van whispered. "I don't know," Duke replied, his voice shaky. "But I think it's over." Van nodded, even though he couldn't see her. "Please, hurry," she whispered before hanging up. She sat in the dark room, her back against the door, waiting. Minutes felt like hours as the whispers continued, growing louder and more insistent. She could feel them surrounding her, pressing against her from all sides. She squeezed her eyes shut, trying to block them out. A knock on the door startled her. She jumped up, almost dropping her phone. "Van, it's me?" Duke came the voice from the other side. She rushed to open the door, relief flooding her body. As soon as she opened the door, Duke stepped inside, his face pale, eyes wide with fear. "What the hell is going on?" he asked, looking around the dark apartment. "I don't know. I thought it was over," Van began, but she was cut off by a loud, rumbling noise. The floor beneath them seemed to vibrate, as if something was moving beneath the surface. A week later, she decided to seek advice from the Buddhist monk who had previously helped her. She hoped he could provide some insight into whether the curse had truly been lifted, or if there was more she needed to do to protect herself and her friends. Arriving at the small temple on the outskirts of the city, she felt a wave of calm wash over her. The scent of incense filled the air, and the soft chanting of monks offered a comforting backdrop. She found the monk she sought, sitting quietly in meditation. He opened his eyes as she approached, as if he had been expecting her. "Bani," said, his voice gentle but firm. "I see the shadows still haunt you," she nodded, her throat tight with fear. "I thought it was over, but I can still feel something, like it's waiting." The monk nodded, his expression serious. "Curses of this nature are not easily broken. The Cham people have deep spiritual roots, and their curses are woven with intent and power. You have disrupted the spirit world, and it may take time for the balance to be restored." "What can I do?" she asked, desperation creeping into her voice. "How do I end this for good?" The monk was silent for a moment, considering. "You must return to the source," he finally said. "The village, you must seek forgiveness from the spirits you have angered. Only then will you find peace." Van felt a chill run down her spine. Returning to the village was the last thing she wanted to do. But if it was the only way to end this nightmare, she knew she had no choice. That night, she called Duke and Soong to explain her plan. Both were hesitant. The thought of going back to the village brought back memories they would rather forget, but they understood the necessity. Reluctantly, they agreed to join her. 3 days later, they were on the road again, heading back to the village. The journey was tense, the car filled with a heavy silence. As they neared the village, the air seemed to grow colder, and a thick fog settled over the road. Van's hands tightened on the steering wheel, her heart pounding in her chest. When they arrived, the village looked unchanged. The same wooden houses, the same dusty streets. But there was a palpable tension in the air, as if the very ground they walked on was holding its breath. They made their way to the house where they had stayed before. It looked more dilapidated now, as if years had passed instead of weeks. The door creaked open, and they stepped inside, the floorboards groaning under their weight. "Why have you returned?" the voice said from the shadows. They jumped, turning to see a familiar figure, the elderly man. the one who had first accused them of being thieves. He looked older now, his eyes dark and sunken. "We've come to ask for forgiveness," Van said, her voice steady despite the fear coursing through her. "We disturbed something here, and we want to make it right." The old man's expression softened slightly, but his eyes remained wary. "The spirits are not easily appeased," he said. "You have brought something into our village that does not belong." Van took a deep breath. "Tell us what we need to do," she said. "We'll do whatever it takes." The old man studied them for a long moment, then nodded. "There is a ritual," he said slowly. "It must be done at the old burial ground. You must seek the spirits' forgiveness there. But be warned, it is dangerous. If they do not accept your apology, you may never leave that place." Despite the old man's warning, they agreed. As night fell, they gathered what they needed and followed him to the burial ground. It was a desolate place, surrounded by thick trees, the ground uneven with graves that seemed to have been there for centuries. The moon was full, casting long shadows that seemed to reach out for them. The old man instructed them to stand in a circle around a small fire he had built in the center of the burial ground. He began chanting in a language they didn't understand, his voice rising and falling with an eerie cadence. Van felt a cold wind sweep through the clearing, and she shivered, her breath visible in the chill air. Suddenly, the ground beneath them began to tremble. The fire flickered wildly, and a low, rumbling noise filled the air. The old man's chanting grew louder, more urgent. One could feel her heart racing, fear clawing at her throat. Then, from the darkness, figures began to emerge. Ghostly shapes, barely visible, their faces twisted in pain and anger. They surrounded the group, moving closer with each passing moment. Van felt a wave of panic, but she forced herself to remain still, to trust in the ritual. The old man continued to chant, his voice rising to a fever pitch. The spirits seemed to hesitate, their movement slowing. Then, as if on cue, they began to retreat, fading back into the darkness from which they came. For a moment, there was silence. Then, the old man lowered his arms, his voice falling silent. The fire flickered once more and then went out, plunging them into darkness. "It is done," the old man said quietly. "The spirits have accepted your apology. You are free to go." Relief flooded through Van, her knees nearly buckling with the weight of it. They had done it. They had faced the spirits and survived. As they made their way back to the village, the first light of dawn breaking over the horizon, Van felt a sense of peace for the first time in weeks. The curse was lifted. They were safe. But as they reached the village, Van couldn't help but glance back at the burial ground, now barely visible in the distance. She wondered if the spirits were truly at rest, or if, one day, they might return. The relief that had washed over Van and her friends began to fade as they left the burial ground behind them. The village, with its eerie stillness and the faint whispers of the wind through the trees, felt like a place caught between worlds. The light of dawn was just beginning to break, casting long shadows that seemed to dance and shift as they walked. Van kept glancing back, her mind filled with a lingering doubt. Had they truly appeased the spirits, or was there more to come? Back in the village, the old man guided them to the edge of the clearing. His face was lined with exhaustion, his eyes shadowed with the knowledge that Van and her friends could only begin to comprehend. "You must leave now," he said softly, his voice carrying a weight that pressed down on them. "The spirits have accepted your apology, but they are fickle. They could change their minds if you linger." Van nodded, understanding the urgency. She turned to Duke and Suom, both of whom looked pale and shaken but resolute. "Let's go," she whispered. They quickly gathered their things and headed toward their car, which was parked a short distance away. The old man watched them leave, his figure growing smaller in the rearview mirror until he was just a speck against the backdrop of the waking village. The drive back to the city was silent. Each of them was lost in their thoughts, processing the ordeal they had just endured. The road stretched out before them, winding through hills and valleys, the scenery blurring as exhaustion set in. Van gripped the steering wheel tightly, her knuckles white. She tried to focus on the road, but her mind kept drifting back to the burial ground, to the ghostly shapes that had surrounded them, and the feeling of cold hands reaching out from the darkness. They reached the city by late afternoon. As they drove through the bustling streets, the familiar sounds and sights of urban life began to soothe their frayed nerves. Van dropped off Suong and Duke at their apartments, each of them offering quiet words of thanks before disappearing inside. When she finally reached her own home, she felt a wave of relief wash over her, She was home. She was safe. Or so she thought. That night, Van tried to sleep, but her mind wouldn't let her rest. The events of the past few days kept replaying in her head. Every time she closed her eyes, she saw the faces of the spirits, heard the old man's chanting, felt the cold grip of something unseen. Eventually she got up, deciding that some tea might help calm her nerves. As she walked through her apartment, she noticed something strange. The air felt heavy, almost suffocating. She paused in the hallway, her heart beginning to race. She felt it again, that familiar sensation of being watched. She turned slowly, her eyes scanning the dimly lit space. At first there was nothing, just the familiar shapes of furniture and shadows. But then she saw it. A figure stood at the end of the hallway, shrouded in darkness. Its features were indistinct, but she could feel its eyes on her, burning with an intensity that made her skin crawl. Van froze, her breath caught in her throat. She tried to convince herself it was a trick of the light, a shadow cast by a passing car. But deep down she knew. The spirits had followed her. Panic surged through her, and she stumbled backward, her hand fumbling for the light switch. She flipped it on, flooding the hallway with light. The figure was gone. She let out a shaky breath, trying to steady herself. "It's just your imagination," she whispered to herself. But even as she said it, she knew it wasn't true. She grabbed her phone and called Duke. He answered on the second ring, his voice groggy with sleep. "Man, what's wrong there here?" she said, her voice barely a whisper. "The spirits, they followed me back." There was a long pause on the other end of the line. "Are you sure?" he finally asked, sounding more awake now. "Yes," she replied, her eyes darting around the room, searching for any sign of movement. "I saw something. In my apartment. I can feel them watching me." "We need to go back," Duke said, his tone urgent. "We need to see the monk again." "Maybe there's something more we need to do," Van agreed, her heart pounding. She couldn't stay in the apartment any longer. She packed a small bag, her hands trembling, and hurried out the door. As she made her way to her car, she felt the weight of unseen eyes following her every step. She drove to the temple as quickly as she could, her mind racing. When she arrived, Duke and Sung were already there, waiting for her at the Khans. Together, they approached the monk, who was sitting in the same spot where Van had found him before. "I feared this might happen," the monk said, his eyes filled with a sadness that made Van's stomach twist. "The spirits are bound to the place where they were disturbed, but if their anger is great enough, they can follow those who wrong them." "What do we do now?" Van asked, desperation in her voice. "How do we make this right?" The monk sighed deeply. "There is one final thing you can do, but it is risky. You must return to the village one last time and perform a ritual to bind the spirits to their resting place. It is the only way to ensure they do not follow you back again." "But you said it was dangerous," Duke interjected. "What's the risk if the ritual is not performed correctly? The spirits could become even more enraged," the monk explained. "They could become bound to you, following you wherever you go, tormenting you forever." A heavy silence fell over the group. Van felt a chill run down her spine. The thought of the spirits being bound to them, haunting them for the rest of their lives, was too much to bear. But they had no choice. They had to try. "We'll do it," Van said finally, her voice steady. "Tell us what we need to do." The monk nodded and began to explain the ritual in detail. They would need to return to the burial ground, bringing offerings to appease the spirits, incense, food, and a small token of their own to represent their willingness to make amends. They would also need to recite a specific chant, one that the monk taught them carefully, warning them to get every word exactly right. 3 days later, they found themselves back on the road to the village, their hearts heavy with dread, but determined to see this through. As they approached the village, the sky darkened, clouds gathering ominously overhead. The air felt thick and oppressive, and one could feel the familiar coldness seep into her bones. They arrived at the burial ground just as the last light of day was fading. The place looked even more foreboding than before, the shadows deeper and darker. They set up a small altar at the center of the clearing, arranging the offerings as the monk had instructed. Then with trembling hands they began the chant. At first nothing happened. The only sounds were their voices and the wind rustling through the trees. But then the ground began to tremble, and a low, guttural growl filled the air. Van felt the hair on the back of her neck stand on end. She kept chanting, her voice shaking but steady. Suddenly, the spirits appeared, more numerous and more menacing than before. They circled the group, their ghostly forms flickering like flames in the wind. Van could feel their anger. a palpable force pressing against her, threatening to overwhelm her. "Don't stop," Duke shouted, his voice barely audible over the growing noise. "Keep chanting." They continued, their voices rising above the chaos, repeating the chant over and over. The spirits drew closer, their faces twisted in rage, their hands reaching out, clawing at the air. Van felt a cold grip on her arm, then another on her leg. She bit down on her lip, refusing to scream, refusing to give in to the fear. And then, just as suddenly as it had begun, it was over. The spirits stopped, their forms dissolving into the air like smoke. The ground stopped shaking, and a deafening silence fell over the clearing. The air was still, the tension gone. Van looked around, her heart hammering her chest. "Did it work?" she whispered, hardly daring to believe it. The monk, who had come with them to oversee the ritual, nodded slowly. "It is done," he said. "The spirits are at peace. You are safe now." Relief washed over them, and Bam felt tears streaming down her face. They had done it. They had faced the spirits, and they had won. For the first time in what felt like forever, she felt a sense of calm, a sense of peace. As they made their way back to the village, the first light of dawn breaking over the horizon, Van couldn't help but glance back at the burial ground one last time. She knew that some part of her would always be tied to this place, to the spirits they had encountered. But she also knew that they had done everything they could to make amends, to set things right. And as the sun rose, casting its warm light over the land, Van allowed herself to hope, to believe that finally the nightmare was over. As the sun rose, bathing the landscape in a warm, golden light, Van felt a weight lift from her shoulders. She glanced at Duke and Sung, who walked beside her, their faces reflecting a mix of exhaustion and relief. The monk had assured them that the ritual was successful and that the spirits were finally at peace. Yet, a small part of Van remained cautious, not fully trusting that their ordeal was truly over. She knew they had done everything in their power to rectify the wrongs, but she couldn't forget how relentless the spirits had been. When they returned to the village, the residents greeted them with quiet smiles and nods of approval. It seemed even the villagers felt the change in the air. The oppressive tension that had hung over the village for so long had lifted. The old man who had guided them before approached, his expression a mix of respect and relief. "You did well," he said, his voice raspy but sincere. "The spirits have been appeased. You will no longer be troubled by them." Van nodded, feeling a surge of gratitude and relief. "Thank you for your guidance," she replied. "We're sorry for any pain we caused." The old man shook his head. "It is not for me to forgive," he said, "but I believe you have done what was necessary. Now go in peace." Van, Duke, and soon took their leave, feeling lighter than they had in weeks. As they made their way back to their car, they passed the small wooden house where they had stayed during their first visit. It looked different now, less foreboding, almost welcoming in the morning light. Van found herself pausing, staring at the house, remembering the fear and the uncertainty of that first night. She felt a strange pull, a sense of closure, and a quiet farewell to a chapter of her life she hoped to never revisit. The drive back to the city was long but calm. They spoke little, each lost in their thoughts, reflecting on everything they had experienced. Van's mind wandered to the events that had led them here, the choices they had made, and the lessons learned. She realized that they had been reckless, venturing into a world they didn't understand, but she also knew they had grown stronger, closer, and wiser because of it. Back in the city, life began to return to normal. The hospital welcomed them back with open arms, the daily grind of work a comforting distraction from the chaos they had left behind. Van found solace in her routine, her patience, and her colleagues. She still thought about the spirits sometimes, especially at night when the world was quiet and shadows stretched long. But the fear had diminished, replaced by a sense of understanding and respect for the unseen world. One evening, about a month after their return, Van received a call from Duke. "Hey," he said, his voice light. "I was thinking, maybe we should meet up, just to catch up. It's been a while since we all got together outside of work." Van smiled, a warmth spreading to her chest. "That sounds great," she replied. "I think we could all use a night out. I'll call soon and see if she's free." They decided to meet at a small cafe near the hospital, a cozy spot they used to frequent before everything had happened. When they arrived, there was an ease between them, a sense of camaraderie that had grown stronger through their shared experience. They laughed, reminisced about their time in the village, and even joked about the haunting, though with a nervous chuckle that spoke to the lingering unease. "Do you think we'll ever go back?" Sung asked at one point, her voice thoughtful. Van shook her head. "I think we've done our part," she said. "We've made our peace, and now it's time to move forward." The others nodded in agreement, their expressions relaxed. They knew that the memory of what they had experienced would never fully leave them, but they also knew that they had faced their fears and come out stronger on the other side. As the night wore on, they parted ways, each returning to their lives, their homes, with a sense of closure. Van walked home with a lightness in her step, the city's night sounds a comforting background to her thoughts. She felt a quiet confidence, a belief that she could handle whatever came next. Back at her apartment, she prepared for bed, moving through her nightly routine with a sense of peace she hadn't felt in a long time. As she climbed into bed, she glanced out the window, her eyes catching the faint glow of the city lights. She took a deep breath, feeling the cool night air fill her lungs, and closed her eyes, ready for a restful sleep. But just as she was drifting off, a soft sound caught her attention, a whisper, so faint she almost missed it. Her eyes snapped open, her heart beginning to race. She listened, straining to hear. For a moment there was nothing but silence. And then, just as she was beginning to relax, she heard it again. Get out, her breath caught in her throat. She sat up, looking around her darkened room, her heart pounding in her chest. She saw nothing, heard nothing more, but the chill in the air was unmistakable. She knew, deep down, that they were still there, somewhere, watching, waiting. She closed her eyes and took a deep breath, forcing herself to remain calm. She had faced them once before, and she could do it again. She wasn't the same person she had been. She was stronger now, more resilient. And whatever came next, she was ready for it. As she lay back down, the whispers faded, the room growing still and quiet. Van knew the spirits might always be with her, a reminder of a world beyond her understanding. But she also knew that she had the strength to face them, to confront whatever darkness lingered in the shadows. And as she drifted off to sleep, a small, determined smile crossed her lips. Whatever happened next, she would be ready. As Van drifted into a light sleep, her mind still buzzed with the echoes of the whisper. But her exhaustion took over, and soon she fell into a deeper, dreamless slumber. The night passed without further disturbances, and by morning, the apartment was bathed in the soft glow of dawn. The city outside was beginning to stir, the sounds of morning traffic filling the air. Van woke up feeling surprisingly refreshed. She stretched, allowing herself to bask in the warmth of the morning sun streaming through her window. The events of the previous night felt like a distant memory, almost as if they had been a figment of her imagination. She decided it was time to reclaim her life fully and stop letting the shadows of the past dictate her present. After a quick breakfast, she decided to head to the hospital earlier than usual. On her way there, she passed by the temple again, feeling a strange pull to stop by. She entered the temple grounds, finding solace in the familiar scent of incense and the serene atmosphere. She approached the monk who had guided them through their ordeal. He looked up from his meditation and smiled gently, as if sensing her presence before she even arrived. "You are at peace," he said, his voice calm and soothing. Van nodded. "I think I am," she replied, "but I still feel them sometimes." Like a whisper in the back of my mind, the monk nodded knowingly. "The spirits have left their mark on you, as they do on all who encounter them, but they no longer mean you harm. You have made peace with them, and they with you." Van felt a weight lift from her shoulders. "Thank you," she said, bowing slightly. For everything, the monk smiled and nodded, returning to his meditation. Van left the temple feeling lighter, more grounded. She knew she would carry the memories of the village and the spirits with her, but she also knew she had faced her fears and come through stronger on the other side. At the hospital, life continued as normal. Van threw herself into her work, finding comfort in the routine of her duties and the familiar faces of her colleagues. She saw Som and Duke frequently, and their bond had grown stronger since their shared experience. They often found themselves sharing a knowing glance or a quiet smile, a silent acknowledgement of what they had endured together. Months passed, and the memories of the village began to fade. Van found herself thinking of it less and less, her days filled with work, friends, and the simple pleasures of everyday life. She even began to explore new hobbies, like painting and hiking, finding joy in activities that brought her closer to nature and further from the darkness of her past. One evening, as she was painting by her window, a sudden chill ran through her, causing her to drop her brush. The hairs on the back of her neck stood up. and she felt an unmistakable presence in the room. Her heart rate quickened, but she forced herself to breathe deeply, to remain calm. "Not again," she whispered, her voice steady. But this time, instead of fear, she felt something different, an acceptance, a recognition. She turned slowly, half expecting to see a shadow or a figure lurking in the corner. But there was nothing, just the fading light of day and the quiet hum of the city outside. Van closed her eyes, focusing on her breathing, remembering the chants and the rituals. She whispered a quiet prayer, a simple prayer for peace. Slowly, the chill dissipated, the room growing warm once more. She opened her eyes and smiled to herself. The spirits were finally letting her go. As she turned back to her painting, she felt a sense of calm wash over her, deeper than anything she had felt in months. She knew finally that she was free from the shadows, from the whispers, from the past that had haunted her. She was free to live her life fully, without fear. That night, as she lay in bed, she thought about everything she had been through, the fear, the uncertainty, the darkness. But she also thought about the strength she had found, the courage to face her fears, and the friends who had stood by her side. She realized that the spirits had not only tested her, but had also taught her something invaluable: to find light, even in the darkest of places. Van closed her eyes, feeling a deep sense of gratitude. She knew she would always carry a piece of the village with her, a reminder of the unseen world and the mysteries that lay beyond. But she also knew she had her own life to live, full of possibilities and new beginnings. And as she drifted off to sleep, she felt a gentle breeze brush across her face, like a soft caress, and a whisper not of warning, but of farewell. The spirits had moved on, and now so could she. The morning sun rose over the city, bright and full of promise, and Bam welcomed it with an open heart. Days turned into weeks, and the sense of normalcy in Ban's life began to solidify. The unsettling whispers that once haunted her thoughts had quieted, and the shadows no longer loomed over her every move. The lingering fear she once felt had been replaced by a newfound strength and resilience. Ban realized that she had not only survived the ordeal but had emerged stronger and more self-assured. One afternoon, while having coffee with Duke and Sung at their favorite cafe, the conversation drifted back to their shared experience in the village. For the first time, they found themselves speaking about it without the weight of dread hanging over their words. "Remember the old man's face when we told him we were leaving?" Duke chuckled. "He looked like he didn't believe we'd actually make it out alive," Sung laughed softly, her eyes crinkling at the corners. "Honestly, I wasn't sure we would. But I'm glad we did. It's strange to say, but I think we're better for it," Ban nodded, a small smile playing on her lips. "I agree, it's like we faced our worst fears and came out stronger. I don't know if I would have believed that was possible before." They all fell silent for a moment, each lost in their thoughts. The cafe around them buzzed with the sounds of live people chatting, the hiss of the espresso machine, the soft clatter of cups and saucers. It was comforting, grounding them in the present. "I've been thinking," Van said, breaking the silence. "Maybe we should do something to commemorate what we went through. Not to dwell on it, but to acknowledge it. Like a small ceremony, just for us." Suong and Duke exchanged glances, then nodded. "I think that's a good idea," Sung said. "It's a way to close that chapter of our lives properly." They decided to hold the ceremony at a nearby park, a peaceful spot surrounded by trees and a small pond. On the day of the ceremony, they gathered under a large oak tree, bringing with them a few simple items: a candle, some incense, and a bowl of water. Van lit the candle and incense, placing them in the center of a small circle they had formed. "This is just to honor the experience," she said softly, her voice calm, "to acknowledge what we went through and to let it go." They each took a turn speaking, sharing their thoughts and feelings about the ordeal. There were moments of laughter, moments of solemn reflection, and even a few tears. But as they spoke, the weight of the past seemed to lift, replaced by a lightness they hadn't felt in a long time. When it was Van's turn, she took a deep breath and closed her eyes for a moment, gathering her thoughts. "I was afraid for a long time," she began. "Afraid of the spirits, of what they wanted, of what they might do to us. But I realize now that fear was also teaching me something. It was teaching me to trust myself, to face the unknown, and to find strength in places I never thought to look." She paused, looking at her friends. "I'm grateful for that. And I'm grateful for both of you. We went through this together, and I wouldn't have wanted to face it with anyone else." Sung reached out, placing a hand on Van's arm, and Duke nodded, his eyes warm with understanding. "We're a team," he said. Always they each took a small amount of water from the bowl on the ground, a symbolic gesture of cleansing and renewal. As they did, a gentle breeze swept through the park, rustling the leaves above them. Van felt a sense of closure, a quiet acceptance of all that had happened. The ceremony was simple, but it was enough. It marked the end of a journey and the beginning of a new chapter. They sat together for a while longer, talking and laughing, their spirits lifted. As the sun began to set, casting long shadows across the park, they stood up, ready to leave. Van took one last look around, feeling a deep sense of peace. She knew that the shadows of her past would always be a part of her, but they no longer held power over her. She had faced them, learned from them, and now she was free to move forward. That night, as she lay in bed, Van felt a warmth spread through her, a quiet joy that came from knowing she had overcome her fears. She closed her eyes, and for the first time in a long time, she fell into a deep, restful sleep, free from whispers and shadows. The next morning she awoke to the sound of birds chirping outside her window, and the soft light of dawn filtering through the curtains. She stretched, feeling a sense of contentment. It was a new day, a new beginning. She smiled to herself, ready to embrace whatever came next, knowing that she had the strength to face it. And so life continued for Van, Duke, and Sung. They carried on with their lives, their work, and their friendships, forever changed by the experience but also stronger for it. They had faced the darkness and emerged into the light, and now the world was open to them, full of endless possibilities. The end.